Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Noah Tolley and I serve as provost here at Calvin University. And I want to thank you for joining us for the third lecture in this year's Healthy Dialogue series. The Healthy Dialogue series is co-sponsored by the Provost's Office and the Sexuality Series. And it reflects Calvin's commitments to engage challenging conversations with humility, love, charity, and respect. Eager to learn with our neighbors, colleagues, and students, and not just with them, but from them. It reflects our commitment to understanding better before we seek to be understood, as well as the vulnerability necessary to listen well and engage with those whose perspectives may differ from our own. While the majority of speakers in this series will roughly align with the teachings of the Christian Reformed Church in North America, the series will feature other voices as well, and we believe engaging those perspectives with rigor, depth, and sophistication is essential to our work as a Christian university. Around campus and also on Viva Engage, otherwise known as AMER, you'll find more information on future speakers, which include Megan DeFranza. And you can find the first and second lectures of this year's series by Darren Snyder-Belusek and Amy Peeler online. And many thanks to Jody Van Wingerden for her collaboration. Yeah, get a shout out for Jody. Jody's collaboration has been a terrific partnership, a real gift to me, to the Provost's Office, to this whole community. And her work has been essential to series development, speaker engagement, and campus engagement as well. And I also want to thank our departmental co-sponsors today, Psychology and Gender Studies, for their support of this lecture. There we go. And now, without further ado, I want to introduce our speaker, Dr. Mark Yarhouse. Dr. Yarhouse is Arthur P. Reck and Jean May Reck Chair of Psychology in the School of Psychology, Counseling, and Family Therapy at Wheaton College, where he also leads the Sexual and Gender Identity Institute. He's the author of many books and articles on sexuality and gender, including Understanding Gender Dysphoria, and also this book, which will be discussed by some of you over the next day or two, Emerging Gender Identities, Understanding the Diverse Experiences of Today's Youth. I should note that Dr. Yarhouse is also a Calvin University or Calvin College alumnus. And so today we are welcoming Mark back to Calvin, grateful for the vocation that God has given him and the ways in which he has walked his path, not only with regard to increasing his knowledge or the seeking the truth, but to doing that in ways that model the virtues that we seek to honor in this series. I trust that you will discern those virtues in Dr. Yarhouse's lecture. He brings charity, respect, depth, rigor, and sophistication that is much needed in these conversations. And so I am glad to host him here. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Yarhouse.
Just this past month, I was meeting with parents who were people of faith or Christians who are bringing to our clinic a loved one who's navigating the questions of gender, identity, and faith. Within the month, someone who's college age, within the month, someone who's 16 or 17. And people of faith, Christians, really navigating what do we do when our loved one is telling us that their experience of their gender doesn't line up with the biological markers and familiarity we had knowing them all through the years that we're seeing this moment. So that's kind of the space that I live in clinically, but when I meet with families, and then in my research and lines of research in that space. It was mentioned that I lead the Sexual and Gender Identity Institutes. This is an institute at Wheaton College where we conduct original research of people, typically people of the Christian faith, not always, but navigating questions of either gender identity or sexual identity, and sort of how they make sense of their sexuality or gender in light of their faith. Here's a couple of resources that we've been able to be a part of. I would say that too, as I go into this, no one does scholarship completely by themselves. I run an institute, probably have 16 graduate and undergraduate students working with me. I have 4 fellows and just collaborators in other institutions around the country. So I will be talking today, but I'm really talking with a multitude of people who work with me, and it's to be unfair to think of it as something that I'm just introducing this summer. So it is a joy to be with you, to connect again with Calvin. It's a case that I really valued here as a student, and grew a lot, and was an admirer of many of my faculty. And so it's a treat for me to come and speak with you and engage with you today and tomorrow. So I'm talking about emerging gender identity. So when I use that language, what am I referring to? So usually in this space, you can think of this group as largely under the non-binary umbrella. In the transgender conversation, transgender itself is an umbrella term, but it really refers to people whose gender identity does not correspond with their biological markers, like chromosomes, gonads, genitalia. And so technically, when you think of transgender, you think of a cross-gender identity, just as you think of a transatlantic flight when cross-Atlantic. But it is an umbrella term for a lot of different experiences, so it would be difficult to say it just means one thing, always a cross-gender identity. But for a number of people, they've said, my gender identity is not with reference to the binary. And so I think of myself, experience myself outside of the binary, or in between the binary. And so that's a gender non-binary. And I just give you a list of types of words that have been developed: every boy, masculine of center, feminine presenting, gray gender, that just really are all under the non-binary umbrella in some sense. Okay, so that's what I'm referring to. Here's some prevalence estimates of transgender. So again, umbrella term. You identify as transgender would be a common question in these types of surveys. They might add non-binary in more recent ones. If you look at the far right one, you can also see with Gallup broken down by generations. You can see higher prevalence estimates for Gen Z compared to boomers. And so those are interesting changes. And then this is from the US Transgender Survey. They just this morning, as I was getting ready to drive over here from Wheaton, had posted a kind of a summary of initial findings. And so that's in the top one. This is over 92,000 transgender. This is adults and 16 and older, but it's at least over 80,000 of the adults. And so you have that most people identify as transgender, either trans man or trans woman, but a robust percentage of people identify as non-binary. And that have surprised me, not so much in this report, because I read it in their original 2015 report, but I'd always thought of non-binary as a kind of small, relatively small segment of the community. But you're seeing it actually grew from 2016, where 2015, 2016 was 35%, now it's 38%, identifying as non-binary. And then they didn't have they do have the ethnicity here, so I wrote that, I added that this morning for white and Latino, racial, Black, Asian, Middle Eastern. So interesting breakdown by race and ethnicity. So in the years that I've been working with families, I've learned like the families that I met this last month, we do have an outward-based where I meet with families who are looking for a gender consultation. It might be a formal evaluation. Does my loved one warrant the diagnosis of gender dysphoria? Are there other things going on that like complicate this question, like what is a spectrum disorder or a depressive disorder, anxiety disorder? Where do we go from here? Question, and how do we improve family relationships that have been strained over the years? Those are probably the four main things that reasons why people would come to see me. But in the time that I've been doing that work, a question that often comes up is at what age do people begin to have a different experience of their gender than what you would have expected maybe as a parent raising your child? And so they asked that question. I'm curious what it is in the new report. Those details aren't published yet, but in the 2015 report that came out in 2016, the age at which you began to feel your gender was different than the one on your birth certificate. And so you can see that almost a third, we say, as I look back, this is recall memory. So an adult doing the survey being asked that question. I remember it when I was under age 5, so almost a third of the sample saying that that's the case. 28% between 6 and 10. So combined, that's 60% prior to puberty. And then 40% from puberty on at different stages. You could even have someone over age 21 for the first time experiencing their gender in a way that's different than what would be anticipated based on biological numbers. And so if you're a psychologist looking at this, sometimes you think about this in terms of the diagnosis, gender dysphoria. That might not be fair. That's not what they asked. They were just asking transgender people. Not all transgender people would meet the criteria for the diagnosis. But what I work with is people who experience distress because of the discordance between their gender identity and those biological markers. And when there's distress that's present, we call it gender dysphoria. And so when I look at this, you might think of this as like early onset, that's 60% prior to puberty. Late onset is what we call the experience of puberty. It's kind of a rough way in which is a subtype of use our diagnostic nomenclature there. Okay, so what are the key experiences and challenges then for Christians throughout these developmental periods? So we recently published a study listening to transgender students at Christian colleges. It was a study of, I'm going to say like 34 or so transgender students. They're not that many at Christian colleges that we were able to participate in the study across 8 institutions. And then we interviewed a subset of them about their experience. What's their experience? A lot of it was what's your experience on college and what's your experience at school. But then we also asked, what was your experience growing up? What was it like as a child? What was it like in middle school? What about high school? What about those types of experiences? So I'm going to go over a little bit of that so you have a bit of a developmental sense for what Christians say their experience is navigating gender identity. So childhood itself appears to be require safety for children in this space. That may seem obvious now, but it's not always been obvious. Security, where they feel valued even when they feel different. How might they feel different? One of the most robust findings of transgender adults, and also true for gay and lesbian adults, is that when they look back in their childhood, they felt different from their peers for gender-related reasons. So what is a gender-related reason? Well, if all the boys want to do this and be involved in these activities, I was not drawn to that, and I felt different from other boys for that. So that's a gender-related reason. So a natal female girl growing up says, I felt different than the other girls because their interests were over here and mine weren't. I felt different for gender-related reasons. It's a pretty robust finding for both adults who are transgender and gay, lesbian, and bisexual, looking back on their childhood. And so that's part of what you're seeing. Children need safety and security when they feel different. They need to know that they matter, that they're valued. They already feel different at a pretty young age. Increased clarity appears to grow across developmental periods, childhood to adolescence, emerging adulthood, but so too does turbulence and turmoil. The older you get, it tends to be more turbulence, more turmoil, until you get to about college age, that kind of evens out a bit. So, late childhood, early adolescence, and increased need for social support makes these periods complex, because you could have peers who support you, but you could also have peers who turn on you. And this is when the threat of bullying became pretty concerning, was in middle school. It requires talking spaces and reflecting spaces for things that for middle schoolers, this is kind of always on their mind, figuring out this aspect of their gender becomes salient. Middle school is where formative experiences about faith begin to show up in our interviews. They start talking more about the faith that they were raised in. These are all Christians. That's what we kind of started there. So they're going to talk about their faith. But faith becomes complicated the older they get as well. This person said, a couple of my friends knew about the confusion I felt, and that's because they asked about it. They asked me if I was doing okay. I told them, I don't understand why I'm not like the other girls. One of them said, you don't act like a girl, you act more like a girl. Another person said, being in a large church was also very uncomfortable because I'm a pastor's kid. There was always people looking at me, asking me questions about things, having me do things for them, and it was strenuous. Like always feeling like I'm being watched and need to be perfect in some example or something. I compartmentalized it, and since it happened like 12 to college about, it was very anxiety inducing, and I still am uncomfortable in most churches because of it. And I think that it pushed me away from a relationship with God a lot because of the judgment I felt walking into church. As you move into high school allows a deepening struggle for most students and a desperate desire for safety, for security. The mental health issues here begin to come to the surface. That's true for us. Just when the mental health issues tend to show up for many people, that's not uncommon. But it is true form here as people navigate gender identity into high school. That discordance I mentioned, it can lead to a lot of co-occurring issues like depression, anxiety. It's not uncommon for someone navigating the space to also be diagnosed with ADHD. I mentioned ASD earlier. Personal faith is valued in high school, but what we began to see in the transcripts was institutional faith was really challenging. Many felt at odds there and strained in those relationships, but not that they were jettisoning their personal faith, but that connecting that to the church was difficult. I was sobbed to my parents, this one participant shared, I hate being a girl. I hate this. I hate this. I'm not supposed to be like this. But for them too, they don't understand. They've seen me being just me. So I hate being a girl because this previous trauma. Or do I hate this because I feel like I should be a boy? I think the most pivotal moment for me was when I was 15 and fully went out in a binder and just presented how I felt, represented how I feel inside. I think the people around me kind of questioned what I was doing, like why I was dressing that way. So a binder here is a way to compress a male female's chest. And what it provides to a lot of people in this space is what we call appearance congruence. When I look in the mirror, I start to see someone who reflects how I experience myself inside. So that appearance congruence can sometimes be achieved through some of those steps. The college years, so this is when we are interviewing them. Everything else is them reflecting on what it was like growing up. But now we're interviewing them at college. And they said that this is a time of significant developmental period. A lot of integration of their gender identity and their spiritual or religious identity. Maybe spiritual identity is a better way to put it, given their struggles with institutional faith. They noted the college years is a time for productive processing of their experience of gender, number of firsts, including first disclosure. And that can be very difficult if your first disclosure is college, because how do you even have that conversation with your parents? And what do they think of the years prior to you saying that now? A lot of times young people feel like they're a little bit on trial for what they're trying to say they're experiencing. What do you mean you're this? Didn't, and then you're sort of, here's all the evidence against what you're saying, which can intensify the conflict for a lot of them. Turbulence and turmoil, here's where it starts to come down a little more from high school peak, comes down a bit more here. But the mental health issues that you saw come to the foreground in high school don't just go away as people go to college. It'd be a real challenge for navigating gender identity and faith while they're at college. The mental health issues worth our attention. It was really nice to have a group of people that are going through a similar experience as you, understanding the same kind of turmoil you're going through. Especially since a lot of them came from religious upbringing, so they understand that kind of struggle in a relationship with God and faith. So I think what the person in part is pointing to is that college becomes a place where you actually run into people like you at higher rates than you did in high school, middle school, where you might have felt like the outlier. Maybe now there's a handful of people who have comparable experience or better conversations and processing. There's a lot of amazing things about it, talking about college, but it's not an ideal place to be navigating any sort of question about gender or sexuality. Just because I don't think it's the kind of topic that people on our campus tend to know how to approach and talk about at all. Not because of a lack of knowledge, but because sort of a lack of clarity. My thought about my gender would kind of waffle between the forefront of my brain, back of my brain, because when I would enter school mode and I was existing in the social space at my school, I just wasn't thinking about it because I knew if I started thinking about it, if I started really trying to process it while I was there, it wouldn't go well. Many people do compartmentalize these parts of their lives. Here's my gender questions. Here's my faith questions. Or maybe here's my academic. Here's what I need to do for school to get things done. And so it can be really difficult to integrate those and weave those together into something whole. In college, faith remains important. Congruence of gender and faith was most often found by movement away from institutional church or traditional views, but many reported feeling affirmed by God. Their current functioning shows more clarity about their gender identity and reduced conflict with their faith, kind of resolving that, coming to terms with the faith conflict they've experienced earlier. And then future expectations. We were really impressed by how many now seem to be more outward facing. What is it going to look like to focus on others around me? There's been a lot of focus on myself, my growth, my conflict. What does it look like to turn outwards and care about others? That was really an interesting development we hadn't anticipated. This person said, I was just thrilled to learn about this stuff, and I got to finally talk about theology and religious philosophy, which is something that I was always kind of wanting to do. It was a really wonderful experience, just kind of on the level of feeling like I could expand my mind and ask questions and still be faithful, still be around people to share my faith. Well, that view of theology changed a lot. It used to be like, this is what I am, but God hates me. And then it was like, this is what I am, but I don't care what God thinks. And then now it's like, this is what I am, but if it fits what we believe about a benevolent God, he's not going to abandon me to hell because I don't want to wear a dress. It's an interesting process of just kind of figuring out what are the consequences of me sorting out these questions. How should I understand this in light of the faith I was raised in? So very difficult. Just wanted to give you a bit of a snapshot of what we're seeing as we interview students in Christian colleges. We actually have a large study right now that we're starting to analyze data from over 1,000 students at both Christian and public universities all over the country, and looking at how people are doing in terms of their mental health and well-being at Christian colleges, state universities. How do they compare to their straight cisgender peers? What does that look like? So there really haven't been many studies designed to look at those comparisons. Most studies like ours hone in on either students at Christian colleges or students at public universities, but to bring them together in a study. I'll share that as we have that analyzed. We have probably be presenting it at the American Psychological Association this August. Okay, so that's a little bit of the developmental piece. And I mentioned the early and late onset. Most of what we've seen throughout my career would be what we would call earlier onset experience of that gender discordance, or as transgender adults look back and say, I first remember my gender the way it is today before puberty. At 60% were saying that. Well, what we've been seeing in more recent years, again, at gender clinics, so not generally the general population, but in general, gender clinics, would be people who are experiencing late onset dysphoria and more natal females. So this comes from the Tavistock Clinic in the UK, but you could get similar charts from Sweden, Finland, the Netherlands, US. So you're seeing a rise in cases of natal females coming to gender clinics at higher rates than ever before, saying, I experienced this discordance, and for most of them, rising to the level of diagnosis of gender dysphoria. So this has kind of thrown a bit of a wrench in the developmental sequence that I've been talking about. What does it mean to have late onset? Why are we seeing so many cases of this? So this has been a hallway conversation among professionals who specialize in this space. But I would say that the two most frequently cited explanations are on this next slide. One would be just self-awareness. This is probably what most people in the mainstream of providing care think, that young people today have more social support, more language, more access to this as a valid experience of their gender. And so they can name that to us more clearly than ever before. So you're going to see an increase in these experiences of diverse gender identities, including cases where diagnosis of gender dysphoria is warranted. So the other explanation comes out of more of a critique, and it's less from, there's fewer professionals who would say this and more public that would say this, concerned parents that would say this. Isn't this just social contagion? Meaning, isn't this being passed around, this transgender identity, as a trend, more like a virus is caught and passed around among a peer group? So this has gotten very contentious, it's very divided, but it's not so divided among professionals. I'd say more professionals are in the self-awareness wing, more concerned parents on the other side. There are some professionals here too, don't get me wrong, but social contagion language comes really out of the eating disorder literature, where eating disorders are one of the most culturally bound syndromes we have, meaning within a culture, you have messages about body weight, shape and size, ideal expectations, standards of beauty and attractiveness. And so those messages can be communicated through a number of sources, including your peers. And the research is pretty clear that adolescent females are more susceptible to those messages, and they can contribute to eating disorders and maintain eating disorders. And so that's been described as a social contagion within that particular explanation. So some people in the gender question have kind of copied and pasted that over here and said, that's what's going on here. So I'm not against this being researched at all. I'm open to research in any of these areas, but I'm not prepared to say it's social contagion because it's just not as well researched as it has been in eating disorders. So I'm not against it so much, but I wouldn't use the phrase. I think it's a bit antagonistic at this moment, but I do think there can be peer group influence. I would locate it in another model that I'll share in a little bit. I also think self-awareness is certainly true. The question is whether that's all that's going on. I've interviewed people in their 50s and 60s who have said to me, I would love to be a young adult today. Because when I was a young adult, I had no idea what I was experiencing. One person said that he would go to libraries and scour medical textbooks to try to find out what was wrong. And he finally landed on whatever the designation was at that time. And it was like a light bulb went off. Like, this is a real thing. Because he thought he was suffering from schizophrenia. He was having a psychotic break. So no adolescent today is going to have that experience. No, they're going to know what this is through the internet searches, social media, peer group conversations, and that's exactly what people are saying. Yes, that's how you're going to learn, and that's where you fall into possible social contagion. So I'm not prepared to go there. I think self-awareness is certainly true. The question is whether that's all that's going on. And I don't personally use the phrase social contagion yet, but I'm open to studies in that area. They just have to be better studies and better design studies than we've seen so far. Now, some recent data coming out of Sweden is also showing the spike you see for transgender women, so natal males experience themselves as a woman. And then on the right, transgender men, so natal females who experience themselves as male. You can see the rise in cases that everybody's documenting globally. But you can also see that it's coming down in the last few years. So some people have cited this as evidence that if there were something like peer group influence and social contagion, it seems to have been leveling off. And we don't need to talk about it in sort of an alarmist way, in the way that we do sometimes hear people having that conversation. So we'll see. I'm not sure if I kind of have hold this from open hand, and we'll see where the data takes us. Okay, so in this conversation, you're already seeing different experiences of gender identity. Maybe you're familiar with the Trevor Project, but just a few years ago, they identified over 100 gender identities. Many of these would be what I would call emerging gender identities. And they reported very similar over 100 sexual identities, which I would call emerging sexual identities. So another scholar in this space has referred to these as emergent identities. So we're very close to our language. And he calls these micro-minoritized identities, meaning the use of emergent identity language to describe both your sexual and your gender identity. So someone who says I'm a pansexual demi-boy is drawing on both emergent, for this author, emergent sexual identity and emergent gender identity in a micro-minoritized manner, a very specific manner to designate something about their experience. So that's his language. I find it kind of intriguing. What does he mean by emergent, though? What is he getting at there? So he's drawing on a typology from Raymond Williams, wrote this back in 1977. And he described how cultural, societal processes can be residual, they can be dominant, and they can be emergent. So residual are things that still carry weight in a culture, but they're kind of residue in the culture. They are sort of from a bygone era. And so older psychiatric classifications would sort of be of a bygone era of talking about like transsexuality, for example, is not language most people would be using today in this conversation, or language of like a vice or religious constructs around this. He would see organized religion itself as residual. It still impacts culture, but it is not where it used to be in terms of its dominant presence. It's the center. Now, that may sound funny to you. It sounds funny to me as a Christian, because I don't think of my Christian worldview and way that I orient myself towards these topics as residue. I think of it as pretty salient, pretty important. But I have to acknowledge, when I look around in society, I don't see a lot of people sharing the reference points that I'm familiar with. So I get what he's saying. And then dominant would be, what are the ways people are thinking about this today? And that would be transgender, non-binary. And then emergent would be the emerging gender identities that I've been describing. So agender, bigender, pangender, gray gender would be all a part of that conversation. So I tried to put together a little chart that could illustrate this. So you have gender identity disorder, for example, was the previous way we thought about this experience. We said of people, you have an identity disorder. And that's viewed right now as more residual. That is going out of fashion. We're not thinking about people in that way. But gender dysphoria is the dominant current way we think about a diagnosis. And that would be a conversation about transgender, about non-binary, but the emergent would be on the right. The residual is more medical and psychiatric and more regulated identity and expression. It was thought of as an abnormality, a pathology, a mental illness. Whereas the dominant it's distress associated with the discordance. We might think of it as an intersex condition of the brain. It's something innate, something immutable. And so in many ways, it's counting on a cultural tolerance to find a place for diverse gender experiences, more of an assimilationist approach to the broader society. But on the emergent side, this is more enacted, more performed, more lived out. And Cover would say lived out in digital and social media for many young people. That's where that is performed for many people. New configurations of knowledge, new taxonomies are then emergent. So I did a similar table for, use the same language except for the very top, but you could do the same with sexual identity. So in his book, he's talking about emergent gender and sexual identities. What I'm mostly talking about today are emerging gender identities, and I am working on a companion book to that book called Emerging Sexual Identities to sort of help us understand these experiences, right? So when Cover presents this, it's intriguing, and you can tell that he relies more on the dominant taxonomy. He's not that drawn to the emergent. He's curious about it. And so in his curiosity, he's asking, what could be the potential benefits of micro-minoritized identities? Why would people be young to be drawn to that? And he's wondering, is it just that the dominant way of thinking about gender or sexual identity are just not sufficiently capturing young people's experience? So they co-create language that captures something at a more detailed account of what they experience. So he thinks that could be a possible benefit. He doesn't want people to fall through the cracks. There's a possible benefit to them. Is it a means of agency for younger people who can develop and articulate these labels that map onto their experience? So he likes those, at least those two pieces of it. But what are the drawbacks, he says? Do these identities, are they going to be just as regimentary as the other ones that preceded them? Will they feel constraining to young people eventually? And I don't know, he doesn't really, just speculates. I think the greater concern would be there's a lot of emphasis on authenticity within the community. When it is enacted, it is performed, when it is embodied, how do we know what you're saying about yourself is true? That's a huge pressure if you're 14, 15. What does that mean when you declare this of my micro-minoritized identity? How do you authenticate that reality to people in digital and social media about how you present yourself? Does that create the potential for greater scrutiny, greater mental health concerns? And he's speculating, he's very affirming, he's very positive about this, but he's questioning that element of it. And I think it's just fascinating to hear someone who's much more drawn to the dominant framework raise questions about the emergent experiences here. So for me, that's me reviewing people who've done interesting things in that work, and it's been very stimulating to read his work. How do emerging gender identity labels come about? So my thought on this is I think there are biological processes and social processes at play. It would make no sense to me to land on one and exclude from the other. I think both are at play. And I tend to draw on the work of Ian Hacking. Ian Hacking is a Canadian philosopher who passed away last year, but he makes a distinction between human kinds and natural kinds. So natural kinds would be like a chemical compound. A chemical compound does not react to how it's categorized, but a human kind does react to how it's categorized. When you categorize people, whether it's through demography or mental health classifications, people respond to how they're classified. That's one of the differences between human kinds and natural kinds. And so he describes what he calls a looping effect. It has 5 elements for how he sees this working, because one of the most significant ways and common ways that we classify people in Western society is through our diagnostic classifications. So you have the classification at the top, which let's say is gender dysphoria today, right? And it used to be gender identity disorder. So that's going to be important. Then you have the people who are being classified. What he would say is people react to how they're being classified. And then you have the institutions who interview those people, listen to those people, have theories about those people. people like me represent institutions who do things like that, listen to people, survey people, interview people. Then you have taken for granted understandings that are shared and reworked within culture. So this might be what's being said on The View or Jimmy Kimmel or conversations like that. The taken for granted realities that we share and pass along. And then you have the experts who get to determine what is true knowledge about this experience. So if we take that and map onto this gender dysphoria, keep in mind that it used to be called gender identity disorder. So that's a good example of the loop. Because if you had been diagnosed with a gender identity disorder, you would have thought of yourself differently than if you were diagnosed with gender dysphoria. An identity disorder is saying there's something fundamentally abnormal about your identity. And today we're saying there's something wrong if you're distressed by the discordance between your gender identity and your biological markers. We will try to alleviate the dysphoria, the distress that's associated with that. So that looped around and we got to gender dysphoria. And what is constructed there eventually becomes an object, a gender dysphoric person. But you have the people who navigate the language of gender identity disorder, navigate the language of gender dysphoria, and they know they're being classified, and they can alter their behavior and even their self-concept, not just individually, but as a group of people who we are in society. And then you have the institution, the research that's conducted, all the things that people like me do. And then you have changes in popular culture that are taught, shared, and reworked, and the experts who get to determine what counts as real knowledge. So there's a number of debates right now in our field, whether you should do medically affirmative care, what you should provide to minors. The debate's really about whether to apply it to minors. Whether this ever desists when they go through late adolescence, early adulthood. There's a lot of professional debates. Those debates will not be settled by me. Likely no one else here. It'll probably be settled by a handful of experts who determine what counts as knowledge in this space. That's hacking, sorry. Okay. So that's the looping effect applied to gender. And I would revisit digital media here and say that in the area of conjectural knowledge, presuppositions, taken for granted realities, what's happening with emerging gender identities is more the co-creation of gender identities through digital and social media. Not critical of that, I'm just observing what I think is happening. It's more expansive gender and sexual identities are now available, and they're enacted and performed and experienced as authentic or inauthentic through social media. So in a sense, that ends up being a part of looping in a way that it wouldn't have been when Ian Hackney first wrote about it. Digital and social media has dominated the gender and sexual identity conversation for younger people in that space. I also think this will bypass the experts. The experts were needed when gender identity disorder moved to gender dysphoria. Someone had to vote it out of DSM, move it into where it is today. And there still may be a need for experts to move gender dysphoria out of the DSM, if you will. But younger people at 16 and 17 are not waiting on experts to validate their experience. They are co-creating and sharing and reworking this experience online. And in a sense, they bypass the expert. And look, if you believe in the looping effect, they don't need it, they bypass it in that way. And you'll probably still have experts chime in to validate their experiences. I would expect that to be the case. But that's kind of a fascinating development around his work and the looping effect. Okay, so let me just offer a few concluding thoughts on emerging gender identities, and then we'll open it up for some questions. So what are we to make of emerging gender identity labels? In my experience, faith communities, conservative faith communities often react to dominant terminology alone. Like I'm in spaces where whole denominations have had reaction to people referring themselves as gay, for example, right? Even as an adjective, they're just not comfortable with that language for Christians. And so you're gonna have the same thing with transgender and non-binary. my main point is here, many people in the church are already pretty reactive to dominant categories. They're not even familiar with emergent categories that I'm talking about today. So I wouldn't expect the same people who react to dominant categories to warmly embrace emergent categories. It's going to be probably the church will be about 15 years behind that conversation. Is what people have estimated this space, and have a hard time knowing what to do with that language. And that makes ministry really difficult. As you walk with people in that space, you end up being reactive to their language, and you're really not ministering to them. You're not really with them. You're not really present. You don't see them because you're now wordsmithing language that you don't understand and you're reacting. So it's a big issue for a ministry response, which I think is important in my opinion. What do we do with, dominant categories? I guess there's a part of me that wants to remind the church that heterosexuality and heterosexual are also constructs developed in the late 19th century alongside homosexuality and homosexual as constructs for a lot of different reasons. But I think for Christians, those map on better to the kinds of relationships that we read about in Scripture and the kind of norms that are presented there. But they're constructs nonetheless. It's not that people didn't exist prior to that who were attracted to this opposite sex or sexually active, procreative, and so on and so forth. But no one would have thought of themselves as heterosexual. They didn't have the language for it. There wasn't the kind of linguistic construct to capture that experience in the way that we do today. So it's not like heterosexuality as a construct was brought down from Mount Sinai. So I think we want to be a little bit careful about how we navigate this space. Doesn't mean, I do believe in the norms that are presented in Scripture for sexuality. But I do think we have to be careful what we cling to in terms of identity constructs and how reactive we are to changing constructs. I don't know that we need to be reactive, and especially for me maybe as a psychologist and someone who serves as an elder in my church and ministers to people. My first reaction is more to show curiosity. And I want to ask the question, how does it function for you before I get to the point of critique? God, I'm not sure what I think about that. I don't mind saying I don't know what I think about it. I say it all the time. But I don't want to come down to the point where I have a knee-jerk response to emerging gender identities without hearing more about how they function. And why do they seem to meet a need that dominant categories don't? And how should Christians engage that and think about that? Would be more my driving question than just a reaction to the identity labels themselves. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there, and I think we'll just open it up. I think we're just going to have you ask questions, and then I'll repeat them here, and then we'll do that. Here.
So that's the other thing, I mean, it's better. So if we look at developmental psychological theories of identity development and take, let's say, Eric Erickson, father of identity development, okay. He always wanted some balance between forming to society and finding our identity. So he talks about we have to wrestle with what's irreversibly given and the opportunity balance, okay. So I'm very comfortable with there being, many categories, and I'm very comfortable with non-binary. But is there a point where having 100 categories and you conform nothing to society, is that also a developmental risk? Kind of telling students, telling young people, you completely make who you are with no reference to conventional society, if you were. Is there a balance we need to be concerned with?
Yeah, I mean, partly what I'm talking about is the co-creation of it in visual and social media, where they're not asking us,
I know.
are we concerned, right? Yeah, they don't care what we think. But it's a good question, I think, for education and what do we teach young people about norms around gender and sexuality? So As a Christian, I have no problem teaching norms about what I think God intended at creation for sexuality and gender. But teaching those norms doesn't mean that exceptions don't exist. So I share your concern that there may be a point of diminishing returns with treating gender and sexuality as just an open expanse, an expansive vista where anything's possible. I don't want to teach that. But it doesn't stop young people from positioning themselves in relation to gender and sexuality in that way. They very much can see it that way and co-create what they co-create through language in that way. But when it comes to like, what should teachers teach in elementary school or middle school, that becomes difficult in a diverse and pluralistic society where we have a hard time agreeing on norms. So I feel more comfortable saying that to a Christian school that says, well, we want to teach a Christian theological anthropology, and that can be articulated. Those norms about sex and gender, in my view, should be presented with grace and humility, as good things from God's hands that do not detract from other people's experiences that don't line up with that. You can teach norms without weaponizing norms. You can say these things are true without weaponizing the thing you hold to be true. And so I'd love to see more of that in a curriculum around this space that acknowledges these other non-normative experiences. Unfortunately, what I think you often have to do in a public education in order to teach non-normative experiences, you can't teach. You just have to kind of create this even playing field. I don't think that's where the Christian wants to go with that. It's not where this Christian wants to go.
But not just theologically, is it healthy for the young person you're counseling to say, throw out all the norms if you don't want to embrace anything?
So step away from the Christian just
Yeah.
in public. So this is what cover is raising the question. I suspect it's not healthy for a young person developmentally to see gender and sexuality as the Wild West of all possibilities. But how you write and teach norms in a diverse and pluralistic culture that doesn't want to adhere to norms is a challenge. It's just not I don't know what we do with that part.
I'm curious, going about that, like the Wild West idea of all the different norms and labels and identities. And then how technology has kind of changed that. Like you have the wiki fandoms that have lists of all of these emerging identities. So you can just scroll through and like research all of them, and you can like scroll through on TikTok and see all these people who have like discovered that more about their identity just over the pandemic. How does that connect?
Well, that is exactly the thesis is for Rob Cover in particular that I cited, that his expert is in digital media, and I think his argument is that is where this is being co-created. So this would be different than most gender and sexual identity development periods in history, because we've never had that kind of the same kind of social media, digital media space to co-create new linguistic concepts, to share them and pass them around, and then be challenged to perform them and embody them. That's what's new about this. I don't want us as Christians to be fearful or anxious about that, but to be wise and considerate. That is a new variable. How is that? How do we want to monitor that, manage that, really speak into that? But that's where that's happening. And I think he's right to raise questions of, does that put undue challenge to a 13, 14-year-old? So at what age should you be expected to authentically live out a micro-minoritized identity with people of all ages who are demanding authenticity from you? Is there any place for you to explore these things without having to demonstrate? Because authenticity almost expects an essentialist understanding of gender identity and sexual identity that the very platform doesn't lend itself to. The platform lends itself to the co-creation and exploration, not the essentialism that's demanded by those who monitor for authenticity. So I would love to see a lot more grace for one another, young people in those spaces, less pressure on them to land in essentialist categories for themselves. So much of this is predicated on constructing identities. I mean, I don't personally believe that all of these gender identities are ontologically distinct genders. I just don't believe that as a Christian. I don't even think you have to add Christian there, but I just don't think that's true. But I am a Christian, so I'm adding it. Sorry, your question earlier about society broadly and non-Christians narrowly is a good one to remind me that some of these things are probably just not good broadly, and I also happen to be a Christian, so. Thank you for that.
Do you have any advice for parents who are trying, or sorry, for kids who are trying to talk to their parents about their experience and like vice versa for that? That would
Yeah, I do help people craft letters like that quite often. So generally, couple of tips. I recommend recommend people be as descriptive as possible. I think you have to remember generationally, if you're 19, 20, your parents, their generation reacted more to labels than you react to labels. So when you say, I'm this, and I wanted to tell you I'm this, they may react so strongly to the label and not to you. So a letter or a text or email, well, this would be better face to face, but I craft letters with people because they read them to them. But if you could bring to that conversation something that pulls the love they have for you forward, that's what I would say. So how do you craft a letter like that? I think you describe your experience. So, mom and dad, I love you and I appreciate all that you've done to support me through the years. How it's been a great experience. Then I think at some point you want to say, my experience of my gender is not the way that I had always thought it was, or not the way that maybe you had thought it was. I, for the longest time, assumed that it would line up with my biological sex, and I'm finding that it doesn't in ways that have raised a lot of questions for me, so descriptive. And you invite them into that if you think they have the capacity to do that. The parent-adolescent relationship is one of the best predictors of a young person's well-being over time. So I'm extrapolating that into emerging adult as a college student. But I think your relationship with your parents is one of the most important things for your well-being. And so a lot of times in this space, you get people saying, well, just tell them, and if they can't get on board and you cut ties, things like that are not maneuvers I could recommend at all to anybody. Unless it's already an abusive situation, what you're really doing is you're severing a potential resource that could be really important to you down the road. So descriptive, then try to invite them in. I would love for you to be able to hear more about this. I would love for you to be able to support me as I'm working out and trying to answer really difficult questions in this space, something like that. You want to get parents away from they gotta fix you, but you do want to invite them into the journey of life that you're having so literally in front of you. You're gonna need them, but realize parents are gonna want to come in and get things fixed. And I'm very sympathetic to parents. We just did a study of several hundred Christian parents, and just there's so little available for parents whose kids come out as gay or transgender. That journey over the next 4 or 5 years is really challenging. And that's not a burden to put on gay or transgender young people. That's just to say, we don't have a lot of spaces for parents to wrestle with what this means for their faith. I have friends who run a Christian parent support group. They would say, when a child comes out of the closet, Christian parents go into the closet, meaning they feel remarkably isolated from their people at their church or congregation, because they're often blamed for their child where they are. And where that comes from is older theories of homosexuality that held that it was the parent-adolescent relationship. As a child grows up, there's a rejecting, detached, same-gender parent, and there's this emotional deprivation that develops, and then that becomes sexualized when you go through adolescence. That's an older Freudian theory, tied to older Freudian concepts. Well, a lot of Christian ministries abide by it. It's remarkable for a church that has not worked to Freud. I love themselves a little Freud when it comes to those things.
I think we have time for one or two more questions.
Okay.
There's one right here.
All right, so you mentioned the DSM-5 probably. So there's been the text revision where they're replacing the term natal sex with sex assigned at birth. Do you think you'll continue to use the term natal sex, or like in your next books and next conversations, or?
Yeah, I used it today, so it's pretty fresh. I tend to use natal sex. I do tend to use it. I think the decision to use sex assigned at birth is really drawing on the differences of sexual development literature, where you could have an intersex condition and you could mistakenly identify someone as a boy or a girl at birth. And I think in meaning well, I think our field has kind of copied and pasted that over to any experience of gender. And I don't find that to be a very compelling maneuver. So I don't tend to use it. I will use it in some settings where that's the norm to expect. I'm not meaning to be antagonistic or like poking at people. I don't find it to be a logical extension from where it came from to just move it over here. So I do tend to use natal or biological. And I know that there's a way in which some people navigating that space some would want me to make that shift so that they can hear that I see them in that conversation. But I do hope there's other ways that I've shown them that I see them. And that I don't have to make every move that symbolizes seeing someone to say that I see you. And I hope that people could hear why I might not. That would be okay. That's kind of where I am today. But I hold these things. I don't try to weaponize any of this. I don't throw these things, pray about these things. So I would continue.
Do we have one more question? All right, well, let's thank Dr. Yarhouse.